Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today's book club episode is brought to us by IVP Academic. Our good friends at IVP Academic have allowed us to have this conversation with the author today, Dru Johnson, on his book, What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture? Comparing conceptual worlds of the Bible and evolution. So we'll jump into this conversation here in a moment. If you go to our show notes, there is a link to IVP Academic. Click that, get this book for yourself and a neighbor. And then also some other resources and links in there. If you want to find a church to call home, there's a local church finder. Just reminders of how to connect with us. You could subscribe to us on YouTube. Yes, these conversations are uploaded video format to YouTube. And there's a playlist drop down for all our seasons in our book club series. So this is under our book club playlist drop down. And then obviously follow us on our podcast app. And then you can find us on Twitter and Instagram. You can email us. And then there's other great resources to engage with us as well. So, yeah, we have Dru Johnson today, and we're going to be talking about his new book. And I'll let Peter further introduce our guest today, Dru Johnson.
Yeah, we have Dru Johnson, who I've actually wanted on this podcast for a long time, and this is my excuse to have him on. He directs the Center for Hebraic Thoughts and has been a research fellow at the Herzl Institute. I'm probably saying that wrong. In Jerusalem, Logos Institute in St. Andrews, and Henry Center, which has a little bit to do with this book, at the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's the author or editor of numerous books, including Biblical Philosophy, Human Rights, and Knowledge by Ritual. He's ordained as an EPC minister and is co-host of the OnScript podcast. It's a pleasure having you on the show, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, yeah. So first off, icebreaker question. We already told you what the icebreaker kind of question was before this, but you were a little bit of punk head before coming into the academic kind of theological world. So tell our audience a little bit about the bands you were part of, what kind of music you played, what instrument you played before coming in.
Well, I grew up playing violin and then viola, and then as soon as I could, I switched to drums because you could hit things as hard as you want, and it was considered music. And so from probably 14 years old onward, I was in a series of punk bands, a heavy metal band at first, and then we shaved our heads, became skinheads, and got into the underground punk music scene. There actually is a documentary about the underground Tulsa punk scene, in which a former high school mate of mine said, "Hey, I went to this documentary premiere tonight, and you were in it." I was like, "Oh," and then they told me about it. I was like, "Oh yeah, I probably." And there's a few pictures of me drunk and shirtless, playing drums in a punk rock band.
I bet there's very few theologians who can say I was drunk, shirtless, and on a punk rock band before I was a theologian.
I don't, you know what? Because I'm also a high school dropout, and I've been surprised how many you meet. You can kind of spot people who are from your same guild or whatever.
Yeah. Travis Barker people.
Yeah. So every once in a while, I've met quite a few people, former skinheads, former punk rockers, high school dropouts is actually not.
I'm a former college dropout who then re-enrolled in college.
See, there you go. So we've all got interesting stories.
Well, my dropout was not really because I wanted to drop out. It's because I was on severe academic probation. I was like, I'm gonna drop out.
Yeah, I mean, I say high school dropout, but I was 3 years a freshman, and they said you'd have to stay 3 more to graduate. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to take the off ramp here. So
yeah. Cool. So that's a little bit kind of behind you, but tell our audience. So read your academic and your kind of writing bio, but tell our audience more about Dru Johnson, just as Dru Johnson.
Well, I mean, my life is, I enjoy academic stuff. So it's pretty much all people are like, what do you do for a hobby? I'm like, I play guitar and drums, and that's about it. Hang out with my wife.
Yep.
I have 4 kids. 3 of them are back in New York City. The college I worked at closed down suddenly at the end of last semester. So I was
King's College
looking for a job. Yeah, King's College in New York City. So we were 12 years there. My kids went there, and then and then they didn't because it closed.
There's a guy from my former church in Oceanside, California, Well, he would have started in 2020.
Well, what's his name? I know him.
I don't remember his name.
You don't know his name. Yeah, it's a small college. I had almost every student, and you know them all by first and last name. So that was the great advantage. You're in the middle of New York City, but you know everybody.
Sure.
Now I'm at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, which is beautiful. I'm here for a year. And I'm in this large college of like 3,500, 3,200 students. And it's really weird for me to walk around on campus not knowing a single. I have 120 students, and those are the only people on campus I know. So it's been a really good experience here, but it's a little bit strange. So yeah, I've been teaching Bible, hermeneutics, some theology, certainly Bible and philosophy for the last 18 years now, I guess. And I started doing it full time about 15 years ago. It was a kind of a fourth job. I was in the military 7 years. Then I was in IT for a while, and then finished seminary at Covenant Seminary and pastored for about 8 years at a non-denominational charismatic church where I'd become a Christian when I was about 20. And then eventually entered the EPC, actually so that I could work in the Church of Scotland when I was doing my PhD. Which was a super interesting experience, especially if you're from the Presbyterian world. I can tell you stories. I don't know if they're fit for the air, but boy, wow. That was the first time I'd ever been in a church that was like 650 years old.
Yeah.
And had to ask myself, is this actually the church? Like, can I legitimately say this is the church? This is part of the church. It was a great.
When were you at St. Andrew?
I was there 2009 and 2010.
Okay, you might have.
I was just there for 2 years.
Okay, there's two professors I had, Darian Lockett and Mickey.
Oh
Klink,
yeah. I know both
St.
of
Andrews
them
before.
Yeah, Darian actually. I took his job at King's. He left King's, and I filled his job. Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, Darian's great. I don't know Mickey Klink that well, but I see him at the conferences. But Darian's a wonderful individual, and I assume if he's friends with Darian, then he's probably a legit dude.
Yep. Yeah.
I like their work on biblical theology as well.
Yeah, they're really good. Darian goes to church like 3 miles away from us.
Yeah.
Or 3 miles away from me in Orange. And he was my professor at Biola. And then Mickey Klink was my professor at Biola. And we've interviewed them both once or twice, something like that.
I will tell you, it was not cool having to walk in as a new guy following Darian having left, because all I heard was Darian's stories. How
he's
wonderful
a phenomenal
he was,
professor.
Yeah. So it was big shoes to fill, which I did not, but I muddled through.
Hey, but you stuck there for a little bit, so you filled them somewhat.
I did stay there. Yeah. I clung like a leach to the job.
That's right. Yeah.
Until the host died.
Question for me, some of the audience is probably, I'm channeling some of them. They're like, wait a minute, high school dropout to academic scholar. How did that How did that happen? And then you mentioned the skinhead thing to clarify that to Christian. So how
can skinheads be Christians?
Not racist skinheads. Well, I wasn't a Christian. That was the easy part.
Yeah. Right.
I wasn't a racist skinhead. My stepdad was black, raised in the South under Jim Crow laws. My sister's black, no relation to my stepdad. She was adopted. My brother's adopted, and I was the surprise. The skinhead movement is actually wide and diverse. It was actually founded by Jamaicans, black Jamaicans, West Indies people in England, the mods, and then eventually it moved into kind of the white working class world, the hooligan world. When it came to the United States, neo-Nazi groups picked it up as the kind of look for their youth, and then if you've seen American History X, that's a good example of one small. But honestly, like if I were to guess, the majority of people who I would identify as skinhead, I have a skinhead tattooed across my back, my first tattoo when I was 15. And people who like seriously identify as skinhead say I was really a skinhead. I bet you the great majority of them were not involved in racist movements at all. I bet most of them were just kind of these kind of fraternal movements.
It kind of brings you into a little bit of a tribe in a sense.
Yeah. And, when I look back there's a great movie called This Is England, which is about the early skinhead movement in England. And it does a good job of showing they were all looking for fathers and brothers.
Yeah.
And then I watched that movie and then just went through my head, all my skinhead buddies, like the 20 or so guys I hung out with, none of us had fathers in our lives at that point in our lives. I mean, we were all, or if we did have fathers, they were emotionally absent fathers in some way, or abusive fathers. So when people are like, how do you become it's like a crack addict. How do you get into that? And it's like, great, you just remove father relationships. And I had a relationship with my father, but we didn't live in the same states. And so, yeah, you're going to look for male bonding, love, brotherhood, wherever you can find it. And so that's where I found it. And so in some ways it saved me probably some even worse things, but we did do bad. Yeah, we were idiots. We were total idiots. I was arrested a lot, booked for no crimes, and that is the providence of God straight up. So
awesome.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So you talk about this early in the book. You're at the Henry Center and researching for this book. So can you tell our audience kind of where the idea for this book came from and what you're hoping it adds to the science and faith conversation?
Yeah. The idea for the book actually comes from a guy named Jeff Fulkerson, who ended up running the Henry Center there with Tom McCall. And I don't remember how. He found me somehow, and we talked about like potential ideas on evolution and creation. And I had done this paper for the BioLogos Colossian Forum years ago, where I basically just said, like, look, everybody wants to disentangle Genesis 1 through 11 from the rest of Genesis and then kind of replace it with an evolutionary storyline. And I was giving like literary theological reasons why you can't disentangle those two. You can say one's not history, whatever. You can say whatever you want, but they're so tightly intermeshed that they don't come apart without destroying both sides.
Yeah.
And so, and it just occurred to me as I was talking to Jeff, or somewhere in that conversation, it had occurred to me, like, basically everything Darwin's worried about with natural selection is the same things that the biblical authors are worried about. Scarcity of resources, that's the curse in the garden. Sexual propagation, curse of the garden.
Fit to habitat,
habitat, curse of the garden, right? Exile, right? So and I didn't actually know how deep those parallels went or how unique they were at that point. I just thought, like, it's not like the biblical authors don't want to talk about these things. They actually are having pretty robust conversations. And I, even before I was a Christian, when I was in college, I remember, and I was fairly antagonistic towards Christianity. I was not like searching.
Sure.
Some of my military deployments definitely caused me to start searching, but I wasn't searching for Christian answers. And I remember just being, a putz agnostic, whatever, in college, and kind of hearing in my biology and my science classes when professors would just make these leaps all of a sudden. They're like, and some evolutionary process brought this about. And I was like, wait, there's a lot of hand waving, mystery mongering going on here, like kind of dogmatism that really made me suspicious.
Without reason behind it. It was like, this is the way it is, and that's it.
Just the way it is. And I was in a psychology program where they kind of just made fun of religious people endlessly. Like, and religious people would have you believe this. Interestingly, when I went back to the same university and did a master's in philosophy, it was like one of the most respectful environments for religious people I've ever been in, because they're like, we're all atheists, but we don't have any better arguments than the theists do. So it was a very respectful and stimulating environment, even if I wasn't super excited about the philosophy we were doing.
Sure.
So yeah, this idea, and then eventually I just kept, coming back to like, and I hear people give these arguments for how do you, what do you do with Genesis 1 through 11? How do you fit evolution into the story? And I'm like, this is kind of a lot of my research projects. I'm like, why is nobody talking about this one thing? They're all trying to say something, but they're missing the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And eventually Jeff Fulkerson came back to me and he said, hey, we got these sabbatical research things, you could come work on that here. And I was like, okay, let's do this. So I still had to apply and like win a competition. As you guys know, in academics is not always fun or pretty. But it worked out. And for me, and actually a guy named Ryan Peterson was there as a fellow with me, who was at Biola Talbot.
Okay.
And Mary Vandenberg, who's at Calvin. It turns out we all came as research fellows with kind of the same goal. We had thought about these things passively for years, decades. And we were all coming to basically say, okay, now's the time where we're going to read the research. We're going to kind of hear what everybody has to say, and we're going to figure this out. That was mildly naive, looking in the rearview mirror. The questions just became more profound, and I probably became a little bit more agnostic about some things. The more research I did, But it was good. I think I got some clarity, and I think I walked away going, okay, I think I understand what evolutionary biologists and psychologists think is going on. And I think there are some massive holes in some of that. And I think there are some things that I'm going to remain politely and cautiously agnostic about and say, I don't know what to think about that because I can't reconcile any of this. So
gotcha. For sure. No, that's good.
The title of the book jumps out in one way or another. So a lot of Christians will see it and say, bristle at it. And maybe, that it's gonna, talk about Darwin and think immediately that what does Darwin have to do with scripture and absolutely nothing. And so there's a lot of probably pushback from many Christians that would see the cover of the book. However, you like what you were talking about in the content of the book, you avoid both ends of the spectrum, saying, Darwin doesn't either that evolution and Darwin agrees with everything or absolutely nothing. So there is, we're going to learn more about that in this conversation. So either zero similarities or 100% of everything. So can you broadly explain your approach to Darwin's evolutionary categories of scarcity, the fit and generation? How these three categories specifically work throughout your book?
I think the first thing is, I do talk about Darwin. The way I approach it is I essentially say, here's what Darwin says. And Darwin was brilliant. I mean, I hadn't read him since college. And I went back and read him. I was like, this guy is really trying to puzzle things out. And he's paying very close attention to the created order. And he trained, to be a minister in Cambridge.
He did, yep.
And so like he knows some stuff. And so just to appreciate his perspective and these deep insights that he had. And then I said, okay, but actually evolutionary science since the mid 19th century has actually progressed. And in some ways, modern evolutionary scientists would be antithetical to some of the ideas of, or they would have antithetical views to what
kind of left it.
Says.
They've left all that stuff in the 19th century then, and very different questions today.
Yes. And some of the data and the findings are pushing different questions on them as well. And even things like violent competition in nature, nature red in tooth and claw.
Yeah, which you talk about a lot in this book. Yeah.
Yes. There's the very popular movement towards seeing evolution as more cooperative, right, rather than competitive. Which I think in some ways is probably true, and in other ways is a little bit naive, but that's just the way it goes. And then I try to be fair to what Darwin is saying, be fair and a broad brush caricatures of this is kind of where evolutionary science is today. Here's where the debates are today. And then here's a chapter or two on how the biblical authors develop that same theme of scarcity, again, from Eden. I mean, it's just remarkable to me that Eden has scarcity, sexual propagation, and fit to environment are the same three things that Darwin identifies as the leading, pressures in natural selection. The same things that Genesis is talking about. And it doesn't end in Genesis 1-11. It just gets sewn into the thinking of all the biblical authors from that point on, even into the New Testament. And I try to show even into the eschaton, it's still dealing with those same three things all the way through to the end. And then I had to do a little research to say, well, how unique is maybe every religion does this,
this was fascinating to read. I love this portion.
That was surprising to me to find out that nope, nobody is talking about this.
The Bible is the only religious text that even talks about this of any of them.
Yeah. And not only talks about it, but it interweaves these same three categories together in this ongoing discussion. And so at any point you can kind of open a chapter. I mean, you can conceivably open to any prophet, open to Jesus, and he is in some ways entering this conversation. And obviously I don't think this is all that's going on there, but it's prominent. And I have some methods that I developed in some of my earlier research decades ago for kind of assessing how can you actually say there's a pattern there? How can you say there's a there, right? Versus are you just reading into the text or projecting your ideas into the text? And so I think for me, I try to be very careful to say no, this is actually something the biblical authors really actively want to talk about and develop. And here's how they develop these ideas. So I don't know if you want me to get into the scarcity, fit, and propagation at this point, or
actually that's I think we'll get into this a little bit, but actually, yeah, maybe I'll change this question because I have a question coming up, but I'll switch. You just talked about scarcity, fit, and generation, and again, we're trying to channel a lot of we have a broad audience, Christian, non-Christian, and whatnot. But I'm trying to channel our Christian audience, like, okay, Dr. Johnson, this is scaring me a little bit that you're talking so much about Darwin's scarcity, fit, and generation. All I know about Darwin is he's antithetical to the faith. So how could you possibly put these categories onto scripture? Maybe what do you mean by these categories? What does Darwin mean by these categories?
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, how do we see this within scripture's account?
So if I could start off by just saying something that is actually probably patently obvious to most people, but is worth saying, is that when Darwin talks about natural selection, he's actually not talking about evolution in the way that most people think of it. Most people think of evolution as ape to man, which nobody believes we went from ape to man. It's a more complicated story than that, even amongst people who believe that. And B, he actually is focusing most of his energy on describing what I've been calling natural selection. So there's this, what does he mean by natural? And how does nature select, right? And I think, again, what I think should be obvious to most people who've read Darwin is they should say, like, yeah, this is empirically true. Like this is actually not debatable for Christians, or it doesn't need to be debatable. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, give up on this fight if you believe evolution or not. I'm saying Darwin is focused on something that is actually not evolution in the way that most people think of it. He's trying to figure out why bird beaks change from island to island over time, which is something that actually can be explained in just a handful of generations of birds. You can actually empirically watch this happen over a handful of generations of birds. Same thing with the recent, it's research. It was more like a living experiment, but it became research on Russian foxes, right, where they were capturing these foxes and they were artificially, so not naturally selecting, but they were artificially selecting them for friendliness. And to their shock, the animals, the length of their teeth, the length of their snouts, the shape of their ears changed, I want to say over 10 or 12 fox generations, like measurably, like a centimeter or an inch or so. The actual morphology, the shape of the fox themselves changed into more dog-like features over, let's say, 12 generations. And fox generations are only a few years each, right? So this is a 70-year experiment. And so this was a huge surprise in the kind of the natural selection camp, because the assumption was all of this takes, I shouldn't say, I'm sure some people knew this, but the assumption was that for most species and most changes, it's just, it's a very slow, steady change over long, long periods of time that couldn't be longitudinally assessed by studies. And now you have a case that over 70 years, you can see iterations of this change, right? Not just one set of generations, but iteration after iteration. And so it brings into question, like, time. It brings all kinds of things into question, focus, sharp relief for the story that's being told, the origin story. So I think there's part of us that should just be able to say, when Darwin, actually what I wanted to name the book, which I'm glad we didn't, but none of my working titles ever make it as the titles. But
I don't think many authors do.
No, in the contract, it actually says you don't have rights over the title. That's the marketing department does the cover and the title.
I figured.
Unless you're really famous. But my working title was What Darwin and Scripture Noticed, to kind of affirm that what he is noticing is what the biblical authors are also noticing, which is that things do change and correspond to their environment. The difference is the biblical authors will put the moral status of the people involved as part of the changing mechanism. And so I don't think people need to put up a huge fight with what Darwin is noticing, because he's just noticing, like, hey, birds' beaks change over a few generations depending on what they're interacting with and what environment they're in and how they propagate their species. That's actually not a controversial take at all. The controversial take is the one that has no empirical evidence for it, is that natural selection partakes in a millions and millions of years long process, or hundreds and thousands of years long process, that goes from ancient hominids to Homo erectus to human, what we now call human, Homo sapiens Neanderthalis, or Homo sapiens sapiens, as we call ourselves. that's actually the controversial claim that there's no empirical evidence for it. And I don't mean that as a slam. I just mean that's a congealing notion about how that happens that can't be studied over hundreds of thousands of years.
True.
So it's an attempt to explain the data, but there's no empirical research you could do that would in some similar way explain the same data. So separating out Darwin and just appreciating what he's doing, and I try to separate out, and I think, well, you've read the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think the more profound conflict that's going on here is that for most evolutionary scientists, they believe the way the world is now is the way it's always been and always will be. All the laws of energy and the laws of nature, as they say, even though laws of nature and laws of gravity and laws of physics are all divine metaphors, which most scientists don't seem to be aware that, if you're saying law, that's a metaphor, and you're like, wait, how does law work? Oh, a lawgiver who is a ruler who orders and constructs. It's actually a divine. It assumes that there is a God.
Absolutely. Yep.
Who is right.
Yeah.
But you can just say, like, look, they'll just say those laws have always been in place. They always will be. Fine. The law metaphor is a good enough metaphor for us to think about that way. And what I try to argue in the book is actually the biblical authors. This is where the real dig is. The biblical authors actually have a very different view. I call it metaphysical because there's no better word for it, I don't think. But they actually believe the world used to be oriented differently. It's now corrupted. It's oriented in a corrupted way. You could say a cancerous way. There's lots of metaphors you could throw on here. A broken, fragmented, fractured way. So it's good but fractured. But it's eventually going to be reoriented to that good way, right? And so they actually have a different view of the kind of the scope of metaphysics over the history of the universe, which then allows them to say there was a time and a place where there was not forced copulation, which is the polite term for rape.
Which, like you're saying, is different than the scientific or general scientific outlook, which things have always been this way, versus the biblical outlook is no, things were different before, and they're going to be back to different in the future.
And that's fine. You can come up with fantasy worlds all you want, but the biblical authors seem to have a pretty coherent view of how this different world, how the world can become different in a good way. And like they seem to have like a very structured, rigorous way of thinking about it. They give hints of it. I argue that we should see hints of it. If this is true, we should see hints of it in the world today. I'm not the first other people. I'm picking up on other people's arguments, of course. So yeah, I want to give some credit to Darwin that he is accurately and adequately noticing something about the corrupted, what the biblical authors would might call, if we in our language, the broken, corrupted, warped world that we experience today. So I think they might look at Darwin and go like, yeah, right on, man. You picked up what some things that we were laying down.
Yep.
You just don't understand it hasn't always been like this, and it's not always going to be like this, right? So
yeah. Maybe to help ground this for some of our authors or for some of our listeners, what are some examples that you talk about in the book of scarcity, of propagation in the scriptural text that obviously don't layer on one to one, but show coherence between both what Darwin saw and what the scriptural authors saw too?
Yeah, and this is where again I want to give Darwin credit, because there is a movement that wants to say no, this could have all been cooperative or mostly cooperative when it comes to, because why scarcity, because Darwin actually, he talks about scarcity, but he focuses more on the competition, the violent competition part. But why are people violently competing? Because there's scarce resources, right? There's harsh climates, scarce resources. You don't really need to
compete if resources are not scarce, because you can cooperate with each other.
And there's some evidence of this in the animal kingdom today. Like the only apes that don't eat other apes and hunt them and kill them are the bonobos, chimpanzees, and they're in a resource-rich jungle where they have all the food they would ever need. And
so we see an example of this cooperation within one of these kind of animal species.
So I think when I want to kind of cut some slack. So when the biblical authors, what they do is they say, look, the curse of the man is scarcity and intense labor that brings about food, but there's never going to be enough. We know about the region of the garden. Actually, again, it's on a map where Eden is, or the garden that's in Eden it's actually in a pretty resource-rich place. It's between two major rivers, well-fed. But of course, Israel is going to be set in like the worst part of it's the only non-fertile part of the ancient Fertile Crescent, right? Even to this day, it's only through a lot of work is that ground going to produce bread and grain. And so they make this grand claim. Again, I'm sure some other people have made it in antiquity, but they're the only ones I could find that make this claim that because of scarcity, violence is a natural thing that emerges, right? So self-harm, I talk about suicide during famine, but also that you might harm other people. And I think there's part of us that goes like, yeah, of course. Like even during COVID, look what people did for toilet paper, right? People get touchy, or Cabbage Patch dolls. I don't know if you remember those when those things were scarce for Christmas, right? But I do want to say, like, okay, maybe we're just calling to mind the worst of human behaviors, and that doesn't always have to be the case. So I do kind of pursue, is that necessarily true? And there is some evidence that goes back pretty far that seems to suggest that wherever there are times of famine and scarcity, there are usually increasing bouts of violence in those periods in human history, even Neolithic human history. There's some evidence of that. So, I mean, I don't think it's wrong to say like, okay, the biblical authors claim this. Is this actually true? Like, does this work? If it's only true in the Bible, who really cares, right? But if it's got to be true in the world as well. And I think my findings over the last 20 years or so of researching it's been amazing to me how much biblical authors seem to be on to the way the world really is, even when empirically studied. So scarcity begets violence, and I think it's assumed in the biblical text. I have to do a little work to say, like, look, if you're an ancient Near Eastern person and you're following this story, you get what they're laying. I mean, there's a reason people stopped in Babel and said, hey, let's build a city here. Because again, it's a densely resource-rich place. Where you can protect yourself. Which again, the assumption is even if you're growing a lot of food, you have to protect yourself. Why would you have to protect yourself? Because other people who don't have the resource
want your food.
Yeah, exactly. So, all the way from that to even the flood itself, I think it's just assuming the kind of resource scarcity, the super resource scarcity that seems to happen between Cain and the flood, is somehow entangled with the violence and the wickedness that deserves that judgment. And then I show how that pops up again and again and again throughout Scripture. And then I think the interesting thing, though, that the biblical authors do is, again, I talk quite a bit, as you probably had to painfully read through, like, what does natural mean here? And I try to show the biblical authors have a conception of nature, but it's very different than what we typically mean by nature. There's some overlap, but they include God's cause, God acting in the world as part of nature. Like, of course, he's God, he created the world, he acts in the world. That's natural, right? And what is unnatural is actually humans not listening to God or / disobeying God, but not listening to God and heeding his instruction and being the kind of people they're supposed to be, which that causes a misfit to environment, right? So I think that's a kind of novel take that you're not going to get in the natural sciences, because they don't really, it'd be interesting if there was a way to study this. Maybe there is. I just have to be a little more imaginative to think about it. But this idea that not listening to God actually creates the context in which you have to be puked out, and you always head east, right? Because east is the problem. East of Eden. Exactly. East is for problem children, and that happens again throughout the entire Bible. Is even in the age of resurrection, the conversation with the Sadducees, like, are people married in the resurrection? He's like, oh, you pitiful people. Like,
you're asking the wrong question.
Are you even worthy of the age of resurrection? Right? Will you be fit to that habitat? Is another way you could put that. So,
not to mention the Sadducees may or may not believe in an afterlife in some.
They seem to be. At least Luke said, he starts the story by saying, now the Pharisees who did not believe in the resurrection came to Jesus and asked him. Yeah, exactly. So, and I have a take in there that's probably going to be controversial, because I don't think Jesus is talking about marrying or giving a marriage in heaven. Okay, so so that's, and then sexual propagation, and this is actually something that was, as I was researching it, I was like, oh wow, I hadn't actually thought enough about this. The difference between propagating your species, which is basically about making children, and then creating generations, thinking about ancestry, like who is going to be my great children that I'm never going to meet, and how are they going to subsist in the land. And so the biblical authors, and this is where I think you get outside of natural selection. Natural selection seems to be exclusive, and appropriately so. Darwin's natural selection is exclusively focused on people, like, how do I make babies with the most number of people? How do I spread my genes out there, right? It doesn't help to explain why people do end up in monogamous relationships, why they don't spread their genes widely, why it happens to be the case.
Which there's a lot of like hubbub around that right now between monogamous and polygamous stuff. There's a big time kind of push into this arena right now too.
Well, and it's I mean, it's interesting. We've kind of been sheltered from it because, you know, even atheists in America are essentially Hebrew theists as far as their ethics go.
Yep. It's just kind of imbibed in the culture so much we don't think about it so much anymore.
Yeah. I mean, even marriage equality is about not one man and one woman, but one woman and one woman, or one man and one man. It's not like
they still
one
think
man and
monogamously.
15
totally.
15 women or something. So there's still that, you know, why they're buying into that uniquely Hebrew ethic, because again, most people did not have a polygamist system. And of course in Genesis, polygyny is on full display, but for the rest of the Torah, it seems to be implicitly or explicitly condemned. It's, at least by the time you get to Leviticus 18, it seems to be explicitly condemned. So they're exploring this idea that people are thinking about long life in the land, which means generations beyond my children and my grandchildren, or even great grandchildren, generations
assuming
that I might
propagation.
never meet. Assuming propagation, which is not something that natural selection can really account for, and it also can't account for. You know, we know, I should say, but by the research, it seems pretty clear that fathers who come and have, you know, sexual relations, stay with that mate during pregnancy, and then help to raise those children, even with primates, those are always better outcomes in the long run. But there's no way that a primate would know that. And, you know, and there's no way that, and actually there's no way that a human would necessarily know that unless there was some wisdom tradition or instruction that said, hey, this is the way, right? So there are little joints of conversation between Darwin's natural selection, evolutionary science, the versions in evolutionary science, and the biblical scholarship, where there is some overlap, some heavy overlap, but then there's always going to be this, like, you know, being exiled out of your environment because of your moral behavior. I don't know how you would ever fit that in a natural,
doesn't make sense in natural selection.
It doesn't make sense. Theory. In natural sciences. But for the biblical authors, this is a rational view, and I would say actually it is a rational view if you believe there's a God and God is involved in the actions of this world. It's pure. It's perfectly rational. Even their view that the world is three-decker, if they have that 3 or 4-decker view, it's a perfectly rational view. It's not as accurate as our view of the cosmos today. We have a more accurate view, but that's assumed that the more technology you have, the more accuracy you have in lots of different views. So we know more about our urinary tract now too. It's not that biblical authors were wrong about urinating.
They just didn't know as much.
They just didn't know as much, right?
Yeah, totally. So that leads, we've already somewhat talked about this.
Sorry, I bled into other questions.
No, but this is good. This is a good transition, because you already talked about other religious texts, and I think this is a pretty big point. You talk about this in your book. The Bible, as far as we can tell from other religious texts, is really the only one that talks about some of this stuff. And like you said, is real about the world that we actually live in versus like some fairy world or just kind of hopeful world. So can you talk a little bit about like how unique the Bible is in its approach to these real issues that is different from what we see from other religious texts?
Yeah, and I always want to tread cautiously here because claims of uniqueness can be overturned with one counterexample. Right? So maybe there is a good counterexample.
Or just broadly speaking, we don't know everything, but as far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we can tell, right? And so, that was one of the, when you talk to people, like what are you doing there with the religion, with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and Darwinism? I'll say, like, look, it's just interesting. I don't know why it's the case that the Hebrew Bible talks about these same things that come up in natural selection with Wallace and Darwin, thousands of years later. But it's interesting, that they both seem to be very interested in this very specific thing. For me, I have a much larger research project. This is kind of a side project in my larger project, which is the biblical literature is its own intellectual world. And in my sub project within that larger project is that if you want to explain why science works, the Hebrew Bible is the only way to get there. So the Greeks and the Romans are not going to help you. In fact, the effectiveness of the scientific enterprise can be boiled down to, this is not entirely true, but it's a good caricature of the more that science dumps Greek thought, the better it understands the world, right? So the history of science is a lot of like, oh, and when they quit believing that God was a circle, they were better able to understand planetary orbits and all kinds of other things. And that's true in mathematics, engineering, and what we call the scientific enterprise today. So I don't know why, when you look at the Chinese creation narratives, I'll also say outside of the Mesopotamian creation narratives and the ancient Near East with Egypt included, a lot of what we consider the major world religion creation stories are much more recent. I mean, some within the, like if you think about indigenous Americans, just the last 1,000 years, right? Or Greco-Roman stories are going to go back to 600-700 years, and then they run into Hittite Anatolian stories, and they kind of merge together or blend with those. So to have a distinct story, and I know everybody's going to say, "Oh, what about?" And so I don't know if everybody in your audience can say this, but people might say, "What about Enuma Elish?"
I was about to say that's the big one everyone talks about.
Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim,
all the quote unquote similar stories to the creation story that we have.
Yeah, and I would argue Enuma Elish. There are some extremely vague parallels there, but when you actually talk about like what they're doing, I don't think they compare that much at all. Certainly the Gilgamesh story and the Noah story of Utnapishtim, that seems to be polemical. I don't know how you could read it otherwise, saying like, well, isn't it, the kind of like the Noah story is like, well, there was a dude, there was a boat, and there were animals, but his name wasn't Utnapishtim, right? That seems a little bit unmistakable when you get down to the details of the raven and then the dove being released. You're like, okay, that's a little too on point.
That's a little on the nose.
Yeah. So those are the ancient stories, and they are doing. I mean, I just think it's worth saying flat out, like the most ancient creation stories are not doing anything like what the Hebrew Bible is doing as far as sewing together these ideas of scarcity, competition, violence. There is competition and violence in ancient creation stories, but it's usually the gods going
gods against the people.
They're either the gods against the people or the gods against each other. I mean, in Enuma Elish, they're ripping each other apart and creating the structure of the universe with it. So it's just one of these kids is doing his own thing, right? And the Hebrew Bible is the one doing its own thing. And what's been remarkable to me, I'm very skeptical of all of this, right? I have to kind of like keep coming to the text and see whether it can prove. I have ideas, but I kind of take a scientific approach. Like, I got ideas, but the biblical literature needs to actually bear it out in a statistically significant way. Otherwise, I mean, you guys have read lots of junk theology that sounds great. It's very poetic. And
we read a lot of junk theology at Westminster for sure. It was more just see what's out there and how do we interact with it. Or like, they believe this stuff. Like, how on earth is this even rational?
There's lots of stuff that is super coherent and poetic and maybe even good. It's just not connected to what the biblical authors are doing. And I'm more interested in what the biblical authors are doing first and putting all that stuff in conversation with it, just like I did with Darwin here. What question were we talking about? Oh, the ancient text, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So I do think there's a legitimate claim to say the biblical authors are interweaving these ideas together in a way that is not even, there's nothing even close to it in ancient literature. And one of the reasons there's nothing close to it would be my guess is because they're not interested in the real world in the way that we are. They don't have what some people would call a critical realism. You'd have to like caveat what you mean by that. But here's what I would say. So you're getting all my spiels here.
I like it.
The thing that why is the Hebrew Bible so interconnected with scientific enterprise today, as I would argue, and other people have argued Judeo-Christianity, but what they really mean is the concepts from the Hebrew Bible and the thinking of the Hebrew Bible. And number one, just most basically, you can't have a full-throated scientific enterprise if your foundational premise about human interaction with the world is this is all a lie.
Yeah.
This is all deceitful, or your body that you inhabit, your soul inhabits, is deceitful. Or that the real stuff is in the heavens, and that's how we know the real stuff. And we have to somehow do some kind of yogic or karmic or platonic interaction with the heavens in order to find things out. I think it's taken for granted that, and I think it's what's good about the scientific enterprise, is it starts with the premise that the world is real. It follows law-like interactions, and therefore we can know it, and therefore it can correct our ideas. It has authority over our notions. And that, if you just say, okay, who in the ancient world believed that? The Hebrews stand alone. Right? Like nobody else thinks that. And that I know of. Like maybe someone will hear this and go, oh, he's not taken into. Great, please email me. And I'm in a work group with a Assyriologist, an Egyptologist, and classicist in Germany. And so, I've run all this past these people. I'm like, do you guys, I'm not just like looking at Google, and riffing, right? Doesn't mean I haven't missed something significant, right? So I'm always.
But you've run these ideas against somebody else who might have an idea or two of what you're talking about.
A better idea than me about this literature. So, because I'm not an Assyriol, I don't read cuneiform or any Demotic or anything like that. So, So I think it's worth mentioning, this work group that I'm in, which I love these people. It's called the Intellectual World of the Ancient Near East, is essentially what we go under. But it is amazing how, as the kids say, the Hebrew Bible hits so different than all of those other worlds. They're working through Akkadian text or Sumerian text and just trying to see if there's any way in which that author or authors are talking about something abstract, right? And I think there is some abstract. Obviously, there's abstract. I think all humans are capable of abstract thought and doing that. But they have to work so hard to show it. And I'm just over here with the Hebrew Bible, flipping page after page, going like, "Oh, here it is again. Here we go again. Here we go again." So they just are doing something intellectually on a whole different level and in a different domain than everybody else around them, and that's worth noting. How, I don't know how much I want to push that line as far as saying they're the only ones who ever had these thoughts in the history of humanity. I don't know if that's true. But they're the ones who tie it into their relationship with God. I will say that. They're the only ones who say, like, and this is how we relate to God, creation, and other humans.
Yeah. That's extremely helpful. And so with this, and I know it's not directly talked about in your book, but it is kind of interacted with. And again, we're trying to channel a lot of our audience who might be weary of seeing Darwin and Darwinian stuff that they're kind of freaking out about and saying, how can we possibly read a book that makes any sort of connection with Darwin whatsoever? So even though it's not a major topic, so why do you think like kind of evolutionary theory kind of swallows up all of this stuff, and our interaction with Darwin tends to be whether this is how we read him or it's just kind of what we hear about him? Versus scarcity, fit, and generation, we always think of, okay, all we're thinking about with Darwin is Darwinian evolution, millions of years, whatever it is. Why do you think we miss, you can say, like, the forest or the trees for the forest? We miss some of this stuff for what we think Darwin says.
Yeah, I mean, I did too, quite honestly. I kind of wrapped it all. In fact, the first manuscript of the book, I kept on saying neo-Darwinism and trying to describe these movements of people. And a friend of mine who's a top-notch research scientist at a major university, he went through the manuscript and he's like, quit saying Darwinism, quit saying neo-Darwinism, just talk about the evolutionary sciences and the specific branches you're referring to. Like, quit lumping everybody in these vats together. And I was like, oh yeah, that's really good. God bless this man. He saved me from so many fights I didn't need to have. Right. And I think it's worth like reading Darwin. Scientists they don't tell you, they're not trying to interpret the material world for us,
or at least they shouldn't be interpreting the material world in some sense.
And I mean, what they're trying to do is explain the invisible world to us,
Yeah.
right? Like everybody can look down a microscope and see what's down there, any sighted person. Everybody can look at a spreadsheet of data, of experimental data, and with enough training, they can figure out how to understand the data and all that kind of stuff. We can all see the same information, right? What we can't understand is the invisible forces that make that data work the way it does. We don't see the invisible for it. You know, like I remember in a nonverbal psychology class, just this professor would drop little experimental facts that would just blow my mind. You know, he'd say like, you know, most people when they enter a store, they turn to the right. And you're like, even if they're left-handed, and you're like, wait, what? And there's these studies done where people, and they, you know, they structure it like certain types of architectural environments, whether you're left or right-handed, you just naturally turn to the right. You're like, if you're handling an object, if you're an American handling an object and something brushes your butt while you're touching it, the chances that you'll buy that thing go down exponentially, right? So how did I get on that?
Like kind of our gut level instinct or reaction to Darwinian evolutionary theory.
So thank you very much. So scientists are trying to explain not that happens. They can observe and they can put the tables and say, hey, every time someone does this happens. They're trying to explain some of the invisible forces that motivate, especially in psychology. There's lots of very cryptic forces that motivate us to do all kinds of things. And so that's all Darwin is trying to do. He's he's an experimental scientist who also is doing a lot of observational research. And he's just trying to explain why these bird beaks are so different, why certain lizards have webbed fingers versus unwebbed, things that cannot be explained by pointing to the data and saying, don't you see, don't you see, don't you see, right? It's all the invisible stuff. So in some ways I want to cut him a little slack. And obviously, I read a lot of his correspondences. There's, thousands of pages of letters of his, and I didn't read all of them, but I read a bunch where anybody tried to say like, hey, the Old Testament might support you on this. And he's like, no, not interested. It's like, I just don't have any time for that kind of thing. So he really wasn't interested in a religious explanation. Some people would say that he actually becomes more devout later in life, but I don't know. And he really probably did think that something like humans descended from common ancestry. And so those are real legitimate beliefs. But a lot of what he was trying to do was just like the same thing I could do by staring out my window at a tree and just saying, why do those squirrels act like that? I'm in Michigan, so I have black squirrels and gray squirrels. Like, do they mate? Would that change their physical features? How would that happen over 10 years? How would that happen over 1,000 years? Like, what would that look like? He's just trying to apply scientific imagination to solve real questions that we might all have if we're trying to understand the world around us. So that kind of initial, I would also be, look, it's the difficulty of this book. If I see a book that says Darwin and Christianity, my instant assumption is they're going to reject the Christian narrative or the biblical scholar or the biblical narrative, or they're going to reject Darwin or evolution in some whole fashion or logical takedown.
One or the other. You can't have it both.
Going that way or the other. Yeah. And so I get that tendency, and I probably have a subtle eye roll or side eye when I see those kinds of books on the market as well. And quite honestly, the reason my eyes roll is because that's what most of those books are doing in some way. They're
whether or not Darwin himself did it, that's what the books are doing.
Right. So I get that. But I do think one of the things I try to do is help people understand what evolutionary science is trying to say, and
which is exactly why we asked the question, because I think people come in with preconceived notions that this is what it is.
So
we hear about it, we read about it from whatever book on the spectrum of these beliefs, versus, like you said, reading Darwin and say, okay, what is he saying, what is he seeing, right? And then not how do we make complete accord, but do we see an accord with the scriptural text?
And I don't have a dog in this fight as far as how people reconcile evolution or theistic evolution.
100%.
My cards are actually not fully on the table in this book, because my cards would be, again, I'm cautiously open to all kinds of possibilities that I probably shouldn't be, but I am. I just
Same here.
I can't be. I have not yet been convinced that the full dogmatic evolutionary story really does explain everything.
Yeah.
And even some attempts, like my friend Josh Swamidas,
which you talk about him a lot in the book.
Yeah, which I think what he does is actually pretty brilliant and it's clever. I'm not sure it fits 100% with what Scripture's doing.
Yeah, he talks about the generation, the Adam and Eve, kind of our conception of where they come from and how we come from them. So people who haven't read him,
if I was looking for an easy out to concord evolution with a historical Adam and Eve, that one is like, that's your eject handle all the way. Like if you just want to like make those two things fit together.
Yeah.
And he's no dummy, and he's also open like to thinking further, but he's not trying to end a conversation. He's trying to start a conversation. He's a great person. So I'm a little hesitant, and I know this happened with one of my other books where I was trying to describe how rituals work and why we should think more about rituals. And then the main feedback in that book is, why didn't you tell us what rituals were right and wrong? Why didn't you talk about which version of the sacraments are right and wrong? And I was like, well, that's not really my job. I'm just like a little dude over on the side. I'm not a church council over here, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't my goal. And my goal here is not to tell you which view is correct, or wrong, or to suggest in some way like, these can be happy partners and they can both be fully right and everything's just fine. I'm actually not convinced. I think at some point somebody's going to have to make a hard decision and say like, I don't think the biblical authors, if we explain to them the whole thing, I think there's parts of evolutionary theory they would just flat out say, no, that wasn't the case and it cannot be the case.
Yeah.
So it is not a concordist approach at all.
Totally.
It is kind of it's, in some ways it's a travelogue of my exploration and where I've ended up. So maybe it'll be a different epilogue to it, 20 years from now.
For sure. So last question, kind of tying loose ends and mostly talking to two groups, I guess, if you can say two general groups who might be reading this book and thinking through science and faith, because it's a relatively big topic, science and faith, and especially so with Darwinian theory and Scripture and just all the cultural narratives you hear about both, and how do we make ends meet with this, which you're, like you said, you're trying to start this conversation, not really end this conversation. So can you speak to both Christian and non-Christian who might read this, who might kind of brush through this work? So for Christians, I'll ask two questions if you want to answer them kind of in order. So Christians first, then non-Christian. For Christians who are either skeptical of or completely turned off to anything to do with evolutionary biology, with scarcity, with fit, with environment, propagation, anything, what would you say to them as a result of your research? And I know your research is not finished, but just like as a, hey, this is how we can think about this stuff. And for non-Christians who essentially assume the same thing that Christians do, that, yeah, these actually don't fit at all. There is no concordance, like kind of in the broader term. The Scriptures share no ground with scientific research whatsoever. So if I'm scientific, I can't be biblical. So if you can talk to both groups who might look at this book and say, yeah, I fall on either side.
Yeah, I would say the same thing to both.
Okay.
I would come from the Scripture's perspective and just say, look, if I know you're not interested in evolutionary theorizing, but you have a version of it going on in Scripture. But they take a different view of the history of the cosmos and the future of the cosmos. And they also have a very specific view about testing things against reality and God acting in history and these kinds of things. So like the view of Darwin's view of natural selection, there's a version of it there already happening in Scripture with some extreme modifications and like some has to be caveated very clearly. And for the non-Christians, I would be like, hey, look, if you trust science, you're already in the world of the Hebrew Bible. There's a parallel conversation in political side. I was debating this LGBTQ marriage equality activist at NYU once, and I gave the kind of the biblical view of sexuality, very traditionalist view, and she said, like, I don't care about religion, I don't care about the Bible. All I care is that me and my wife, can have equal rights as everybody else. And I had the unpleasant job of going up after that and saying, like, I know you say you don't care about the Bible or religion, but the contention that you deserve equal rights because you're a fellow human is actually is a uniquely biblical
comes
view.
From the Bible. Yeah. Welcome to the Bible.
And really does not come from anywhere else in the world.
No,
like
you can't ground that in anything else besides the biblical record.
So you actually are are already inhabiting a biblical ethos.
Whether or not you know it,
you are
assuming a biblical ethos when you say this.
But and this is kind of a parallel to what I'm doing in this book, and then I have to say, but they also have other views that are interwoven with that we're all created equal view as well. That
not pick and choose. It's like you kind of have to go with the whole thing.
Yeah. So cherry picking. So you can reject the whole thing, or you can go with it and just say, fine, I'm just going to go with culture. But you have to understand your culture came to that through a specifically Hebraic view of politics, human anthropology, what we are, and what our obligations to God and each other are. And if you just say, like, fine, you want to believe that, it's just kind of inconsistent.
Yeah.
To say I'm going to choose this rather than the Brahmanist Hindu view of these relations, or rather than the traditional North African view or something. That's fine, but I think today it would be true, and this is what I'm trying to do in the book, and say, hey, if you're Christian and you care about this, like there's actually a more nuanced view than you realize about science and about natural selection, and for the theistic evolutionists, I'm going to say, like, it's fine, but it has more to say than you think, and you can't just pick and choose the parts you like. You can't just go Genesis 1 through 11, not history, legend, functional, whatever, atheological, all these kind of, but we'll pick it up at Genesis 12 and roll from there. I'm like, it's so intertwined all the way through that you can't do. It's like no, it's a bad. I was going to say it's like a metastasized cancer, but that's probably a bad analogy. You will. It's like the alien from Aliens. Removing it will kill the host or whatever. It's that deeply embedded. It's like saying I want to be a human, I just don't want blood and veins. Like you, it's just not. It's inconsistent. My fear is that, especially because I work with a lot of Gen Z, the younger, and even millennials, like being inconsistent doesn't bother them at all.
No.
So, and I mean, lots of people in every generation that they're like, I don't care if this is coherent and consistent. I don't care if I'm cutting off the tree I'm standing on, so we can have this conversation and say, like, this coheres with history, this coheres with the biblical literature, this coheres with what science has done. But I don't think naively for a second that then is going to win everybody over, and everybody's going to go, oh, okay, therefore I must think more seriously about what Scripture has to say about it. But at least it can be for people. For me, it puts a pause and say, like, wait, you want to say I believe in science, then let's go down that road. If you say that, right? Oh, I only believe in logic and reason. And well, let's go down that road and talk about that. Right?
I do have one question too.
No, sorry, you said that was the last question.
I know. Last Peter question.
Last question.
This is more curiosity. What would your response be to evolutionists that reject Christianity? So Christian people that are just only on the Darwin evolutionary theory tract, not Christian, and then they would reject the Bible, saying that we are, as human beings, uniquely made in God's image. So as a Christian, how would you respond? You're like, actually, biblically, we are made in God's image, and this is how we are.
Yeah. I don't know if I could deal with the uniquely made in God. I mean, that would be a long conversation about what that means. And of course, that's been rooted in all kinds of silly things like rationality or, something like that. I would certainly challenge them on the assumption that what they're doing just makes sense. I would repeat back to them words I've heard evolutionary biologists give in speeches in public, which is that most evolutionary theory is extremely fragile theory, meaning that, and I obviously, since I started working on this book in 2018, I've been watching the literature more closely. That almost any find, you dig up anything that looks hominin or human-like or ape-like, and they date it however the dating works, because that happens different ways in different places. They date it to 500,000 years ago, or anything they dig up can overthrow the timeline of humanity by, like, most recently overthrew it by 500,000 years.
Yeah.
That's, even in the scale of evolution, that is not a short period of time for human evolution. So And I learned this from studying science. I mean, I think one of the reasons I was attracted to the sciences is because I really wanted to, like, how do we know things confidently? Well, scientists seem to know things confidently. So I took statistics and research methods, and I was hooked. I was like, oh wow, there's like all kinds of checks and balances, and you all know, like, one of the biggest checks and balances in like being confident is N. How big is your sample size, right? The number of people. And so I think when you're dealing with extremely small sample sizes of fragmented data, and lots of arguments from silence, because anything you dig up tomorrow might overthrow what you think today, we should expect to then see, for the next 100, 200, 300 years of this kind of research, we should just expect to see lots of reformulating of evolutionary theory. I think it'll still be some flavor of what it is now, but it would not surprise me in 100 years ago, just from the reading I've done over the last few years in this world, that they may have radically different beliefs about where humans came from, how recently they came, how old they came, how quickly the changes happened, you had the same thing in geology, right? The slow drip geology movement that basically stood the test of time up until the mid 20th century, when all of a sudden is it called calamity or disaster geology? I don't remember what it's called, but huge calamitous events that sculpted out major parts of geological formation. So the Badlands up there in, is it Oregon or Washington? They believe were actually created in a day or two by a massive ice dam break, where up until, the late 20th century, that was thought to happen over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of slow drip irrigation, right? So you'll have similar problems. And so I don't think, when you see those problems, I don't think Christians should say like, oh, haha, see, they can't even get their story straight or whatever.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I think you should just expect it to morph and change as people are struggling to deal with the data under this. And I'll be interested to see if, like, radical new ideas like an Einsteinian shift happens in the theory of evolution. If somebody like all of a sudden reimagines the whole thing and they're like, wait, we've been missing. Now, maybe some different form of evolution. But
which is exactly what they did with the time theory, when they're like, no, time is not exactly static and the same everywhere else. It's
or maybe time's not even a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's the big debate right now. Like, if you want to hear like your mind melting slowly, listen to metaphysicians talking about the greatest arguments that time might exist, and they're all just indication. They're not even arguments; they're just indications that time might exist. So, there's a lot of mysteries out there. I think evolutionary thinking is one attempt to solve one massive mystery, but it's because it's so tenuous and fragile, it has to change over time. Which means that Christians who are trying to, like, engage the conversation should take that fragility seriously. Because just to be quite honest with you, there are some theistic evolutionary movements that basically say, like, look, this is true. Christians just need to get over it, and we need to find a way to get them over this, and just buy everything that you would say. And then they have to come back and backtrack, because things that they thought were so dogmatically true turned out to be not so dogmatically true.
New findings came in and changed things up. They're like, oh, okay, I guess we got to change this.
And that was part of their, like, statement of faith about evolutionary theism. And so, So I think, and I think just a spirit of generosity and curiosity and healthy agnosticism will go a long way in helping Christians engage this.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Johnson, this has been, a really fascinating discussion. Your book was really well written.
I'm honored that you read it, actually, because I can tell you guys actually read the whole thing.
I actually read the whole thing, and I loved the writing was helpful, and like it was a joy to read it. And sometimes these kinds of books can be a little bit of a slog.
I'm glad to hear. That's actually the highest compliment you could ever pay me, because my writing is horrible and I worked really hard on it. So.
Yeah, the writing was really good, and you interact with legitimate scientific studies. You interact with modern scientists, with Darwin. So it's not just like a biblical getcha or science has got all things right. It's a true and honest look at this. And I really do encourage people to pick up this book, to read it, to give it a fair stab and say, let's concord everything, but where can we see the biblical author seeing the same stuff before Darwin? What's he picking up that he may not know accords with scripture in some sense? And not to say that this kind of closed the door on the science and faith discussion,
Yeah,
but I think it aids it. I think it helps some conversation partners to continue this conversation. So thank you so much for coming on our show, for talking about this. And lastly, plug stuff you're doing, plug your podcast, plug whatever you got going on.
Well, I host the Biblical Mind podcast. That's for the Center for Hebraic Thought.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of host the OnScript when I can.
Yeah.
And I'm actually getting ready to start a fairly big research project with Muslims, Jews, and Christians on creation and evolution. So kind of looking at how the different faiths are tackling these different topics as well. So there'll be more on that coming out in the near future. And I'm finishing or middle of the way through writing a book on how to understand biblical law, because it's might be one of the most misunderstood, modern
100%.
projected, so doing that for Baker Academic, which is been a fun book, because it's just going to help people not commit the same mistakes that we all do when we come to biblical law, and will open the beauty of biblical law and its justice and its mercy for the vulnerable in ways that I think most people don't appreciate.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and it's been a pleasure having you on our show.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.